Okay, buckle up, because we're about to dive into a story that sounds, well, less like real-world conflict and maybe more like something out of a spy movie.
Oh, absolutely. High-stakes stuff.
We're talking trucks, right? Carrying what looks like totally normal cargo, driving deep, deep into enemy territory, only to vanish, and then bam, a surprise attack hits a major military target miles and miles behind the lines.
It really does stretch the imagination, doesn't it? A
Yeah.
perfect blend of, I guess, deception and just pure operational boldness.
And that incredible operation, codenamed Spiderweb, that's what we're deep diving into today. Our mission really is to peel back the layers on this audacious plan, understand the tactics, how they pulled it off.
The strategic significance.
Right, grasp the significance and figure out what insights operations like this, offer for modern conflict.
And our guide for this journey is the analysis from Professor Christian Rieck. We're drawing specifically from his podcast episode, June 7, 2025, titled Drohnenschlag gegen russische Bomber, Strategem 8. He really gets into the why and the what comes next.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Ukrainian intelligence pulls off this deep strike, not just near the border, but far, far behind the front lines, targeting Russian strategic bombers, just sitting there on the tarmac.
Right. The core event was Ukraine successfully smuggling combat drones, like incredibly deep inside Russian territory before launching them.
And these weren't just any old planes, strategic bombers. These are vital assets for Russia's long-range strike capability. The outcome, well, according to the estimates Professor Rieck discusses, significant damage or destruction to maybe 15 to 40 aircraft.
Which, I mean, if you look at the total fleet size, that represents roughly 10% of Russia's entire strategic bomber fleet, maybe even a bit more, depending on whose count you use.
10% of a critical fleet. That's not something you just shrug off. As the source points out, look, it's not going to end the war tomorrow, but it's a really sensitive blow because it hits Russia right where they probably felt most secure, deep in their own backyard, their hinterland.
Exactly. Kind of shifts the geography of the conflict in a very unexpected way. The source highlights this as a real strategic novelty.
And the immediate practical impact? Well, taking that many bombers out of action, even just temporarily, is highly likely to reduce the frequency of those devastating Russian air attacks on Ukrainian cities.
It directly impacts their ability to project power from a distance.
Yeah.
Okay,
so the big question: how on earth do you get combat drones that far into hostile territory without anyone noticing? This is where the spy movie plot twist gets really fascinating.
Well, what Professor Rieck unpacks is just the sheer ingenuity of the infiltration method. So Ukrainian intelligence didn't use military vehicles, nothing obvious. They used trucks transporting tiny homes.
Tiny homes, like little houses?
Yeah, I think container-sized, prefabricated houses moved by an official, totally normal-looking company.
Tiny homes as Trojan horses. That is brilliant.
It really is something. And the secret, apparently, was a double ceiling built inside these tiny homes. The drones were stashed up there in this hidden compartment, which allowed them to be launched discreetly, not from Ukraine, but from within Russia itself.
So they just drove these houses across the border through normal commerce checks.
Precisely. And here's another detail from the source that's just wild. Many of the truck drivers were apparently largely unaware.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they thought they were just moving prefab houses. They weren't like witting participants in a major military op.
Imagine finding that out later. Good grief. The source mentions over 100 drones were launched this way. That's an incredible amount of strike power delivered via, well, the most unexpected route imaginable.
It really highlights how exploiting civilian infrastructure can be such a potent tool in modern asymmetric warfare.
This gets us to the crucial question then. Why did this actually work? How did they manage this deep infiltration and achieve surprise?
Well, Professor Rieck offers a really compelling perspective, and it's kind of rooted in Russia's own policies. Russia views Ukrainians in the annexed territories as Russian citizens, right?
Right, they issue passports and so on.
So this means you have a population that speaks Russian, looks Russian, and in many cases actually holds Russian passports.
So people who outwardly appear to be Russian could be operating internally, effectively as sleepers?
Exactly. It becomes incredibly difficult for Russian counterintelligence, for their security forces, to distinguish between a genuinely loyal citizen and someone who might be working against them just based on, ID checks or how they look or talk.
That makes deep infiltration much more feasible.
Significantly more feasible than if they were looking for obvious foreigners.
Yeah. That's a critical vulnerability, kind of created by their own political stance. Okay, but what about air defense? Surely Russia has layers of defense, especially around strategic assets like bomber bases.
They do, of course they do. But the source argues their air defense was likely blindsided by the nature of the attack. They're heavily configured to detect and counter threats coming from a distance. You have cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, larger aircraft.
Traditional airborne threats coming from the expected direction.
Outside in. Yes, exactly. They just weren't anticipating small, low-flying drones basically popping up and launching from unexpectedly close by. Surprise was absolutely key here. Their defenses were looking way out there, and the threat materialized right on their doorstep, so to speak.
Okay, let's maybe step back and look at this through a wider strategic lens. This is where Professor Rieck's analysis gets really interesting, connecting it to ancient stratagem or war ruses.
Yeah, it's quite striking, isn't it, how these patterns of strategic thinking from, like, thousands of years ago still apply almost perfectly to a conflict using 21st century drone tech. Professor Rieck specifically links Spiderweb to Stratagem 8. It's known as secretly march into Shenang.
Okay, tell us about that historical parallel. What's the story there?
Well, the classic story is about a general who needed a surprise attack after a setback. So he deliberately made a big show of activity on the obvious expected route of attack, loudly repairing roads, building bridges, making it look like that's where the main force was going.
Creating a diversion.
Exactly. But secretly, he sent small, highly mobile units over these really difficult, unexpected mountain passes. And these units then suddenly converged way behind enemy lines for a devastating surprise attack, coming from a direction the enemy just wasn't watching at all.
So you make the enemy look one way, while you're secretly coming from a completely different, totally unanticipated direction.
Precisely. And isn't that exactly what Ukraine did with Spiderweb? Instead of a big frontal assault or launching long-range missiles from the usual direction, they arrived unexpectedly with these small, unconventional units, the drones hidden in tiny homes deep inside Russia.
It's the modern version of sneaking over the mountain.
Kind of, yeah. It allowed them to deliver this surprising and incredibly effective blow right under the enemy's nose.
That connection is really powerful. It shows strategic wisdom isn't just about the latest tech, but these timeless principles of deception and surprise. Now, whenever a deep strike like this happens, the immediate fear, and I'm sure a lot of listeners are thinking this, is escalation. Doesn't this just make Putin furious and lead to something, well, worse?
That fear is totally understandable, and Professor Rieck tackles it head on. His core argument is, look, the war has already escalated. Russia is already bombing civilian areas. They're targeting critical energy infrastructure, attacking cities relentlessly day after day.
So he questions whether there's a truly new, qualitative level of escalation that this specific strike introduces beyond the devastation that's already happening.
Right. He suggests that if Putin had some, devastating, game-changing move or some strategic wonder weapon he could deploy, he likely would have done so already. Regardless of this drone strike, waiting for a relatively contained provocation like this one to unleash something entirely new doesn't really fit a rational strategic calculus, according to this analysis.
And what about the most feared responses, like attacking NATO countries or, God forbid, using tactical nuclear weapons?
Professor Rieck analyzes this from sort of Putin's perspective, focusing on the strategic cost-benefit. Why would Putin attack a NATO country? Germany. The UK. There is simply no strategic gain for him there. He wouldn't seize territory. He wouldn't cripple Ukraine's war effort that way.
No upside.
No. What he would absolutely guarantee is bringing the full might of the entire NATO alliance directly into the conflict against Russia. That puts Russia in a vastly, maybe even existentially worse strategic position.
Okay, so the potential costs are just astronomically higher than any possible benefit.
Exactly. And the same logic, he argues, applies to tactical nukes. Using them on the battlefield would be horrific, obviously, but it's unlikely to instantly win the war for Russia. What it would guarantee is unprecedented global condemnation, isolation, and potentially direct military intervention against Russia by other major powers. From a cold strategic standpoint, it just makes no sense for Putin to cross that threshold in response to this specific attack.
So the source argues that while it's emotionally provocative, these really feared escalations like attacks on NATO or nuclear use, they just don't align with Putin's core strategic interests.
That's the analysis presented, yeah. Now let's flip it and look at the strategic benefit for Ukraine. And here, Professor Rieck draws on another classic stratagem. Number 2. Besiege way to rescue Zhao.
Okay, what's the setup for that one?
So in that historical scenario, one army was tied down, besieging a critical city, let's call it Zhao. Another army wanted to lift the siege, but realized a direct attack on the besieging force would be too tough, too costly.
Makes sense.
So instead, they attacked the enemy's home base, their capital city Wei. This forced the army laying siege to abandon their siege of Zhao and rush back to defend their own homeland.
So attacking the core relieves pressure elsewhere.
Exactly. It relieved the pressure on Zhao, and crucially, it dispersed the enemy's concentration of force.
So you hit the enemy's vulnerable core to force them to pull forces away from where they're concentrated and causing you problems.
Precisely the mechanism. And this is identified as a major strategic benefit of the spiderweb attack. By hitting deep inside Russia, targeting assets way back in the hinterland, Ukraine forces Russia to divert military resources. We're talking air defense systems, reconnaissance aircraft, internal security forces.
Stuff they could be using on the front line.
Exactly. Away from the front lines in Ukraine. Away from projecting power externally. They have to redeploy this stuff to defend their own vast territory now.
It spreads Russian strength thin across a much larger area.
It does. And just as importantly, perhaps, it creates psychological insecurity within Russia. It shatters that illusion that the war is something happening only far away, inside Ukraine. This attack brings the reality of the conflict home to parts of Russia that felt pretty insulated before.
That forced dispersal and the psychological impact, those are significant benefits for Ukraine, weakens Russia's focus where it matters most, on the front.
Absolutely. That's the strategic logic presented.
Okay, let's turn to how Putin publicly reacted to this. The source notes his response was, well, pretty muted, wasn't it?
Yeah, what's particularly telling, according to Professor Rieck's analysis, is Putin's public posture. He largely ignored the incident, at least initially. Russian state media significantly downplayed it. They described it in vague terms, mentioning minor damage, maybe a damaged shed, or perhaps one plane slightly scratched, that sort of thing.
Which sharply contrasts with satellite imagery and other reports showing much more extensive damage, right?
Exactly. And the source interprets this downplaying as a strategically clever move, actually. By minimizing the public acknowledgement, Putin prevents Ukraine from claiming this massive, undeniable propaganda victory. And he avoids appearing weak or vulnerable, both to his domestic audience and internationally. It sort of sows uncertainty about the true impact.
Controls the narrative by just not engaging with the scale of the loss.
Precisely. However, the source definitely doesn't suggest he'll do nothing in response. The analysis is that he will likely continue or maybe even escalate actions already planned, like the ongoing missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities, which, it's noted, did occur even after this bomber strike.
So more of the same devastating attacks, perhaps intensified rather than something qualitatively new and different.
And intriguingly, the source speculates that Putin might, down the line, take credit for some successful strike one that was probably already in the works anyway, and then declare that as specific revenge for the bomber attack.
Claiming it retroactively.
Yeah. Doing it after the fact, without announcing it beforehand, lets him claim a retaliatory win without the risk of announcing it first and then potentially failing to deliver, which would obviously be a propaganda loss.
That makes a certain kind of strategic sense if your focus is controlling information and perception. The timing of the strike happening just before planned peace negotiations, that also feels significant.
It certainly does. Professor Rieck points out that the targeted bombers were apparently fueled and ready to go. That suggests Russia might have been preparing its own major strike, perhaps intended to strengthen their position right before sitting down at the negotiating table.
So Ukraine's strike could potentially have been a preemption, neutralizing that potential Russian move before talks even started.
It's raised as a distinct possibility, given the timing and the readiness of those bombers. And it really highlights a key aspect of Russian negotiation logic, as described in the source, this idea of negotiating from strength.
Right.
In this kind of framework, costly military actions are seen as communicating resolve much more effectively than, cheap talk, diplomatic statements, verbal assurances, that kind of thing.
Costly actions speak louder than words, essentially.
In the strategic language, yes. The source notes there can be real cultural differences in how the meaning and impact of actions like this are interpreted. The Western tendency might be to react with fear of increased aggression.
Yeah, the escalation fear we talked about.
Right. But from the Russian perspective, that reaction might actually validate this approach of using force to signal intent and strength in negotiations.
It's a reminder that actions have these layered meanings, especially in conflict. The source also briefly touched on how understanding credible threats, like in cooperation theory, is relevant here. Basically, if an aggressor thinks you won't respond forcefully, they're more likely to aggress. So demonstrating capability and willingness to impose costs, even deep inside enemy territory like this, can be a form of strategic communication itself, aimed at deterrence or maybe shaping those negotiation dynamics.
It really underscores the intricate psychological and strategic game being played right alongside the kinetic one.
Okay, let's quickly recap this deep dive then. We've journeyed into this incredible spiderweb operation, looking at its, well, frankly, astonishing method of execution, using tiny homes to carry hidden drones deep behind enemy lines.
We saw how its success connects back to these ancient strategic principles specifically, using deception to arrive unexpectedly, like Strategem 8, and forcing the enemy to disperse their forces by hitting a vulnerable core, which echoes Strategem 2.
We analyzed the strategic wisdom behind the strike, kind of pushing back against those common fears of a completely new level of escalation by understanding the source's perspective on why certain really feared retaliations are perhaps strategically illogical for Putin.
And we dissected Putin's calculated public reaction, the downplaying, along with the analysis of the likely actual less publicized responses, and of course the fascinating dynamics introduced by the strike's timing relative to negotiations, especially that idea of costly actions as a form of strategic communication.
So what does this all tell us? I mean, it really reveals that modern conflict is this complex mosaic, right? Blending cutting-edge tech with age-old strategic wisdom, exploiting vulnerabilities rooted in things like identity and perception.
And where communication isn't just in words, but in the costly actions taken.
It certainly gives you a new appreciation for all the layers of complexity involved.
Definitely.
And maybe here's a provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry forward. What if the real strategic communication in conflicts like this isn't the speeches leaders give, but the high-cost actions they choose or maybe choose not to take? And how might understanding these ancient patterns of warfare actually give us a clearer lens to view the often unpredictable moves on today's global stage?
Yeah, that's a lot to ponder about history in the present day, isn't it?
It truly is. This deep dive into spiderweb really shows just how interconnected strategy, technology, psychology, and even deep history are in shaping the Western world.